Ladies and gentlemen, our first real panel today, as distinct from individual speaker, is moderated by my good friend and co-chair, John Stratakis, a partner in the law firm of Poles, Tublin, Stratakis, and Gonzalez in New York City. The members of the panel who will speak on a very timely subject, strategic and political turbulence, are Kathleen Haines, non-executive director of Genco Shipping and Trading, Stefanos Roulakis, an associate in the international law firm of Blank Rome, Markos Kounalakis, a foreign affairs columnist of the McClatchy Syndicate, and Kristin Holth, the non-executive director of Maersk Tankers and Maersk Drilling, and a senior figure in the world of ship finance, not only Norwegian, but throughout the world.
Good morning, and welcome to our first panel of the day, Political Turbulence and its Effect on Shipping. We have assembled a group of industry veterans and commentators to discuss a topic that keeps executives up at night, global political turmoil. It's become a cliche in recent years. We seem to experience political turmoil and earthquakes every few months. Throw in the accelerating superpower rivalry between China and the US, and it makes for a hot mix. Meanwhile, the global effort to reduce carbon emissions has also put great pressure on shipping operations and has changed the way company managers think. And efforts by governments to combat money laundering and tax evasion have led to clampdowns on offshore jurisdictions. The shipping industry generally plods along and adapts like a chameleon to the changing circumstances. In fact, shipping often thrives in chaos and turmoil. So we have a lot to discuss, and we'll see what our panel sees in its crystal ball. Here to discuss are Kristin Holth, who was one of the star bankers in ship finance over the last 15 years with DNB Bank. She now serves on the boards of GasLog, Maersk Drilling, Maersk Tankers, and High Tech Vision. Markos Kounalakis is a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and a globally syndicated foreign affairs columnist for Miami Herald and McClatchy. During the 80s and 90s, Dr. Kounalakis was the prototypical foreign correspondent covering wars and terrorism and revolutions all over the world for Newsweek and NBC News. Actually, I thought Joel McRae would be impressed. He's now also the president of the Washington Monthly magazine. Kathleen Haines has a deep and varied career in ship finance, having served as CFO of Heidmar for many years. She's now on the board of directors of Genco Shipping and Trading as a non-executive director and audit committee chair. She's also a principal of Holbridge Capital Advisors, a financial consulting and investment firm. And Stefanos Roulakis is a lawyer practicing with Blank Rome in Washington. His work is focused on US law and regulations, including a wide range of regulatory matters and domestic and international environmental standards, international trade, and sanctions compliance. So let's jump in. We have many elephants in the room, and present company accepted. The first elephant in the room is the COVID-19 pandemic, which changed the world in many ways and has brought a lot of political turbulence along with it. One of the issues that has animated the discussion has been a renewed focus on complex supply chains. There was a big kerfuffle last year when it was discovered that so much personal protective equipment and medical equipment was made in China. And governments wanted to bring their manufacturing back home. And the Biden administration in the US has continued this push with an executive order to reduce US government purchases of foreign-made goods. Obviously, world trade is not going away, but is it changing and how? My question first to Kristin Holth is, what long-term effects might there be on shipping from current efforts at deglobalization to simplify those supply chains, or is it just political sloganeering? Mute. Kristin, you've got to unmute.
Sorry. It's yes, I don't have a crystal ball, John, but thank you for asking. It's an extremely interesting, important, and challenging question. if you look ahead, if you look at the next couple of years, world trade will continue to grow. We had an extreme minus 5% or 4% reduction in GDP this year. Next year expected to grow by 3 to 4, and the same the year thereafter. So world trade will continue. That is, I think, the core parameters. And shipping represent 85% of the transportation in the world. But most companies will de-risk in a way by being less dependent on a region, less dependent on one supplier, and diversify in that respect. That will have an impact on transportation. But it doesn't mean it will reduce, but it will change transportation. So I think it's important to look into what it really means in reality for the various sectors. And if you look now at the container sector, that has really boomed during the last 6-9 months, because you have a new trade system, or trading in a different way, amongst other things. So when you squeeze one place, it opens up another place. So I would not be too pessimistic for shipping as such. I think the various segments will be hit in different ways.
Right. I'd like to throw a sort of a variation of that question to Markos. With the new U.S. administration, it seems that America is being re-internationalized. And I wonder, how does President Biden balance the Save American Jobs agenda with his inclination to re-engage in multilateralism? There are a lot of nativist tides in his own party as well.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to comment on the previous question, which is I actually share an office. Next door to me is H.R. McMaster, who is serving the last administration. And I wanted to reinforce your question, which is your comment, which is we are going through what he called the Gwyneth Paltrow situation, which is conscious decoupling. And that is, in fact, going to change the way that exactly what Kristin says. It's going to just basically require those who are involved in trade to figure out new places to go. It's not that the trade ends, it's just that it shifts direction. Regarding the Biden administration and its seemingly conflicting desire both to increase manufacturing and purchasing in the United States, but increase multilateralism, there isn't necessarily a change. It could be multilateralism that is targeted rather than across the board. So on the manufacturing side, on the dependency side, you might see not just onshoring, but also what we call nearshoring. So looking for some of these multinational organizations to move their manufacturing and their industries closer to the United States. That means Mexico and Canada. Of course, that would affect shipping. The second, however, is in the quest to figure out how to have a force multiplier in its national security structure. That requires the rebuilding of alliances. Now, alliances don't necessarily mean more trade. It just means a betterment of relationships with nations that are aligned. And probably the first thing we'll see out the gate is the development of this conference amongst democratic nations. And so, yet again, it certainly is a very positive thing from a political perspective, but it probably has no effect, or maybe even a negative effect, on trade itself.
And Kathy, I mean, in the U.S. and for shipping in particular, we look to the Jones Act, and every now and then we hear, Jones Act is going to be overturned or repealed. Do you think it's now here to stay?
It's interesting because it's been a long time since I worked in Jones Act, but started a career at OMI. We had Jones Act was most of our fleet at that time before we moved on to foreign flag. But so I find it pretty interesting that now there's a lot of support for the Jones Act, at least coming out of the Biden administration this past week. And I think there's a lot of pressure, especially with offshore, from the different unions to make sure that it is U.S. flag ships that are supply boats for the offshore industry, and that, that creates more American jobs. Of course, Biden, was supported by a lot of swing states that need support. So I think it could be a very interesting place to look at in the future.
John, if I could jump in on the Jones Act, something I deal with day to day. You know, as far as repeal of the Jones Act, you know, I think basically the U.S. Constitution gets amended about as frequently as the Jones Act does. So I would, you know, I think the Jones Act is here to stay. It's had, you know, pretty much bipartisan support, except for the fringes of the Republican Party and some other, you know, members that want to see it go away. But, you know, I think basically every administration has supported it, most secretaries of defense. In the past year or so, there's been pretty significant changes in terms of interpretation, or at least confirmation of what the Jones Act is and what it isn't. And I think what CBP did in a process that concluded a little more than a year ago was sort of confirm that the Jones Act is a transportation law as opposed to construction law. So I think Kathy's exactly right, talking about offshore services and you know, construction being the key area here. But I think what this has done is sort of created some clarity for the industry and allows for sort of win-win situations where you have the domestic U.S. industry focused on transportation, and then, you know, foreign flag industry, you know, from Norway, from Scandinavia, Belgium, you know, to be able to do a lot of the construction work that the U.S. flag does not have the capability. And I think a great example of this was in Block Island, off the coast of Rhode Island, where the first U.S. Offshore wind farm was created. And that's a sector that you know, the administration really supports, and there's been Jones Act policy put together there. So I think that'll be an interesting sector to follow, but I don't think the Jones Act is going anywhere.
And I think, okay. Stefanos, you had a good point about joint ventures. I think that's one thing that there's a lot going on in shipping that we have to deal with, and it will require, if not formal joint ventures, but definitely cooperation between charters and ship owners, end users, to finance all this and to actually make it happen. Nobody can just do it by themselves in a way.
All right, before we move on from COVID, one big issue for the shipping industry has been the humanitarian crisis of thousands of seafarers that have been stranded at sea because politicians could not figure out a way to get them safely ashore. So there's been an effort now among private companies to address the issue. And I wonder whether you see a chance for some kind of global agreement that would be binding and enforceable to help these people. And I guess I throw it really to Kristin and Kathy, who are maybe up on this. Kristin.
It would have been great if we managed to have a global or international agreement on how to handle seafarers, because they've really been hit hard. They've been hit extremely hard because either they have been on board very, very long and not been able to go back to their family, or they've been waited to go on board again to work, to have their salaries. So it's been a tough time for the whole crew situation. But for now, there is, I think we all are into even closer lockdowns during the last month. So to have a good solution here, I don't see that is actually imminent. But I would say that we have managed quite well if you look at the whole situation and how it has been, how challenging it has been.
As you know, the Neptune agreement has been signed among private companies, as you said, John. But you know, I think the key is to make them key workers and get seafarers vaccinated and allowed to move. You know, companies have had to take it on themselves. I know at Genco, we've had to charter planes to move crew around because there's not even flights from port to port, you know, with the restrictions in travel. So it has been quite a challenge to the companies and obviously, especially to the seafarers. And you know, looking to the future, how will young people want to become seafarers if they see this could be a problem? So some kind of, I don't know what the solution is, but some kind of solution needs to happen. And at least the industry is doing a lot to publicize it. And I think the newspapers and things have helped in that because, you know, unless you live on a coast, in the US at least, nobody, you know, if you say I work in shipping, they want to see your brown UPS uniform.
Right. So I'd like to jump to another that sort of takes us to another elephant in the room, which is ESG. And I would consider that an S, you know, in ESG, the social. But ESG has put a lot of pressure on companies, particularly public companies, that face shareholder activists who are demanding either high returns financially or ESG, or sometimes both. But you have conflicting issues for companies among their many other obligations as a public company. And it's sort of, I think, driven some companies to either stay private or go private. And I wonder, and I guess I would throw first to Kristin, because I know you've spoken on this in the past as well. Public or private, has it become impossible to stay under the radar on ESG? And I know the banks have also been putting pressure on their borrowers to give more attention to ESG. So I wonder how it's being integrated into shipping.
It's not even the elephant in the room. It's a big theme. It is the most challenging theme the industry have on the table. To me, it's nothing to do with private or public. It has to do with the core elements of the policy of the company. So we need, as a company, to handle E and the S and the G. And I would say it's a G that is a fundamental issue. It's the most important issue, because if you don't have core G, if the G is not handled in a respectful and a good way, you don't have the structure to handle the S or the E. And I would say it's become, if you look just 6 months back, even 12 months back, it's changing. And yes, I've been very involved in this, and also in my time as a banker with the Poseidon principles. Now that it's actually 20 banks enrolled, more than $150 billion of portfolio. And in January this year is the first time they disclosed the portfolios. This is important, or the alignment of the portfolio to the Poseidon or to the IMO requirement. And this will have an impact on this company's business, obviously. So I would say it's not just for the bankers. If you look at the bond market, if you look at the equity market, it's a capital. The requirements from the investors is there. In the bond market, you have not seen, in the bank market, you have seen prices on the lending related to how you handle the ESG. Now it has also coming into the bond market. Last week, we had 2 bonds being issued, both with C-SPAN and Odfjell, where you had that element. It just shows how incorporated this is in the business. If you look at Larry Fink's letter coming out a couple of days ago, the requirements BlackRock, just an example, Core, obviously the biggest investor, puts on not just to invest, but to de-risk onto where he takes out the money, where he puts in the money. Requirements they set on the companies they invest in. It's just capital is showing the way. So it's not just the banks; it is the capital in a broad sense, and I think that's been an extremely important element. So the companies need to not just to do it for themselves, but they also take this very seriously. There is not one company you meet this day. It's not one annual report you read where they don't disclose their sustainability profile, their sustainability policies, the targets, and obviously, most importantly, how they meet their targets. So for us now, I think the industry is really taking this in an extremely positive way.
Markos, do you see that in other industries as well that you cover?
Well, I think what Kristin's pointing out is that a lot of this is really driven by social movements and political pressures throughout the world within the domestic environment. And so these corporations and leadership and those who are funding them are reflecting the palpable shift that's occurring within societies themselves, and the recognition that these basic demands are ones that are now an expectation, a minimal expectation of not just their representative governments where they are democratic, but of their industries who represent this. So yes, I would say across the board, there is an expectation and now a very active conversation within those industries to achieve exactly these goals, which in many ways, once they are addressed, seem as if they've been neglected for many years. So there's an awful lot of catch up. It's going to be expensive to some degree on the front end as they try to actually shift from their business as usual to a business that is much more responsive and reflective of the societal needs. And but I think in the long run, and I'm sure that this is going to be understood as well, it is the most efficient, and in fact, most in the long term, you'll get the highest ROI once those goals are achieved.
Awesome. Well, it's certainly getting a lot of attention.
If I can have another comment, John, on this, and
sure.
Again, just referring to some, as he said, yes, the companies that have sustainability in order, they have shown higher return than other companies. So it's really not a matter of something you have to do. It's a way you become competitive. It's how you build an edge to get access to capital and resources, and not only resources in the form of capital, also people. So I think it's become such a core element in your success as a business, driving the business.
Stefanos, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I fully agree with what Kristin and Markos are saying. I think I particularly, Markos's comment about the shipping industry in particular, I think really resonates with me. I think the shipping industry is a great story to tell about, its ESG. I mean, in terms of, goods being shipped and, the environmental externalities of that, there's really no other mode that comes close. As far as the social aspect of it, we all, almost everything that we touch was transported by a ship. So there's tremendous social value in the shipping industry as a whole. These are not the norm, but stories of people being saved at sea, ships diverting. This is a long tradition in the maritime industry, and in many cases an obligation. So I think there's a tremendous amount, especially on the E and the S side, which I'm more familiar with, that recommends the shipping industry compared to other industries, what Kristin is saying about the G part being fundamental, as far as the organizing principle within the companies, I think that really ties, the other two aspects of it together.
Right, we're actually starting to run low on time, so I wanted to jump to sanctions, which is a big, obviously a political issue as well, and the U.S. has used them as a battering ram for many years. Europe as well has used sanctions on different targets, and I just wonder, whether you guys think the U.S. and I guess Stefanos, you can jump on this first, is whether the Biden administration is just going to aim at different targets, or is it going to ease up on sanctions?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. Certainly the past 4 years, we saw a significant amount of sanctions activity compared to the previous 4 years. I think the number of listings were something on the order of magnitude of 50% more. Additionally, the methods that that we saw were sometimes very fast and furious. I recall John Bolton's tweet effectively saying that dealings with Venezuela could lead to secondary sanctions. So that caused some confusion and really incentivized folks to take a very precautionary principle in any sort of dealings. So I mean, this creates interesting options for the Biden administration. The outgoing administration said that it gives them a lot of leverage, and I think there is some truth to that, in the sense that they don't have to change things necessarily. They can keep going the current course. They can de-escalate certain sanctions and without sacrificing too much political capital, should there be sufficient return on the other side. And it allows them to take a look at their own foreign policy priorities. One interesting that's being talked about a lot right now in Washington is Iran. I mean, President Biden was part of the administration that negotiated the 2015 JCPOA agreement, and part of what he talked about on the campaign trail was rejoining that. Recent moves by Iran have made that quite difficult. Iran's domestic political situation will play a role in this, as well as the U.S. Domestic situation. But, so I think a wholesale return to the JCPOA will be difficult, at least certainly in the short term. And then parallel to that, portions of the JCPOA are sunsetting. So it really leaves an open question about what that looks like. So, there's a lot there, and it also became quite a big issue in the 2020 election.
Kathy, you as a CFO of a tanker company had to navigate those sanctions probably with great care. So we saw, I think last week, Indonesia arrested 2 tankers outside their port. They were, I think, one Iranian, one Chinese. And how do you see that playing out?
Well, just to go back a little to Stefanos talking about Venezuela, I had a lot of experience in Venezuela on things changing overnight, and we had ships stuck there for a year, actually, just because no one could decide who was in charge. Was it the, head of VESA? Was it the charterer? Was it the owner of the ship? Or was it Aimar's commercial manager? I mean, it was, again, that was really bad for the crew. We said the humanitarian issue, this crew is stuck on this ship forever. But so sanctions, I think, are not against sanctions per se, but I think just clarity of how they're going to be enforced, and in an organized manner. You just don't overnight, because obviously you can't just move a ship overnight, right? So I think that will be helpful. But there are people, we have seen that people are going around the sanctions for sure.
So let's jump quickly, because I want to touch on the environmental issues. We just briefly discussed it. We have the Poseidon principles that are in place now that are guiding the relationship between banks and their borrowers. DNB was one of the forerunners of this as well, very important to the bank, the climate issue. Where do you see the future of the tanker industry, for example, Kristin? I mean, it's such a big part of our industry. Oil, it's going away? I mean, we have so much invested in there. How do you see that playing out?
We need oil for a long time, and we might have seen like a plateau between 25 and 29. So we still need tankers. We need product tankers. We need to transport. So, but it is becoming more and more challenging to address capital towards those industries. But I think what is important to see is not just is it green or is it brown? It is the incremental improvement. Which are the companies and that take the R&D seriously, that trying to find new solution, being on the design of the ship, on the propulsion, on the fuel. So how can you make your ship more efficient? How can you make certain that you are in the forefront of the technology? I think that is the most important. because that is where also the capital will go towards those who take that across the industry, because this is not just about the shipping industry finding the solution on their own. This is very much across any industry. So, and you have many, you can have a big bet. Is it hydrogen? Is it battery? Or is it the carbon capture storage, which is really the platform for the future? So for a company to have a sustainability, to have a focus on technological development, to reduce your footprint, to improve then your sustainability business, that is what is the most important.
Well, all right, so that's, I mean, I think it takes us to a good opportunity to wrap up comments. And I think one big thing takeaway is for me is wondering what the alternatives are going to be long term, whether it's nuclear or wind or batteries or what have you. But anyway, I'd like to ask you all if you have any final comments, maybe starting with Markos, to sort of wrap up a little bit the picture of our panel.
Sure. You know, on the last comment from Kristin, I think that while incremental movement will be continue to happen with those enlightened organizations, there's going to be an increased pressure, in particular now that the Biden administration is in office, on these issues, and maybe accelerate that incrementalism to something that is going to be almost required. On the sanctions front, I think you can look to, again, the United States for a much more targeted sanction regime, rather than sort of a scattershot regime and a reflexive type of approach. Just like Stefanos said, I think the Biden administration finds itself in a fairly fortunate position that it has a number of these sanctions that it can then leverage for whatever their foreign policy goals may be. And then finally, I think what sanctions are creating are these intense flashpoints that those in shipping have to be much more cautious of, because the tensions have been raised and the domestic politics of many of these countries around which these domestic tensions have been raised will try to find external means to manage that. And specifically, I'm thinking about the Straits of Malacca, around Taiwan, and certainly the Gulf region. So while there's a good story to be told about the risk, about how risk is being minimized with a reliable administration with policies that are rational, I think that there is still the ongoing reality that the world continues to turn and that pressures will increase and that all of these trends will require an acceleration.
Stefanos?
Yeah, to build off what Markos said, both now and at the beginning of the panel, you know, I think multilateralism is here whether we like it or not. And John, you pointed out at the beginning about the rise of China, and I think we are living in a very different world, obviously, than the Cold War. You see countries, you know, that have dealings with the U.S., that have dealings with China, that have dealings with Russia, that have dealings with others. So I think that is the reality, that multilateralism is part of the world that we're living in. And Markos, I think a great example of that, and you mentioned the Straits of Malacca. If you look at the you know, the railway that's been built there, you know, that shows that there's, you know, sort of quintessential the Belt and Road Initiative. You have the sea lanes, then you also have the overland capacity. So I think that is a reality, and I think that also ties into sanctions. You know, I think the biggest thing that we've seen is that, you know, this is a very big stick that the U.S. holds. Of course, also the EU, but it's really the dollar that drives this. So you know, the U.S. has to be careful about being a victim of its own success in this regard. We saw Venezuela with the Petro try to go around this, but you know, the shipping industry has done, and I can say this from experience, you know, a remarkable job of complying with a very difficult landscape. And the question is, how much longer will the shipping industry and others continue to do this before you know, dollar dominance becomes you know, something that's seriously questioned? So it's you know, be interesting things to think about in the next few years.
Good segue to Kathy.
Okay. Well, I think 90%, as we know, 90% of the world's goods travel on the sea, and I don't think that's going to change. The biggest issue I see right now is how is everyone going to finance this new emissions control? Right now, actually good for shipping. There's not a lot of new buildings on order because no one wants to take the first leap. It's expensive. And you might go the wrong direction if you build a certain engine. So it's going to take a lot of cooperation, as I said earlier, between charters and find other financing mechanisms on how ships are going to get upgraded or built new.
Kristin, final thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. I think the new government in the U.S. really been a tipping point for the green evolution in a way for the U.S. and for the U.S. to be now on board with the various international organizations and supporting it, because these are issues where we all need to take in the same direction, and you need big economies. And I think there isn't now any large country which hasn't a net zero policy, emission policy, and the U.S. now also coming on board for that. I think has been extremely important. I think what Kathy said, access to capital and resources will be very important and challenging. So we need to make certain that the investors understand the incremental steps and the investments the industry take to improve when it comes to the footprints and their sustainability.
Thank you very much. And it's really fascinating discussion, and we'll see what turbulence lies ahead. There's always something coming down the pike, whether it's Taiwan or the Middle East, or who knows what's coming.
An excellent panel, and now we're going to turn it over for questions to John Stratakis. John?
Thanks, Dave. We do have a few questions here. I'll start with maybe the most provocative one. Do you have a feeling for how the Biden administration would respond to a major superpower crisis, such as a Chinese effort to take over Taiwan? Markos, I guess that seems aimed for you, maybe Stefanos.
Sure. Thank you, John. And it's actually, while it may seem theoretical and it may seem a far-off possibility, I think we have to see what just happened in Myanmar as sort of a curtain raiser in this regard. Because it really becomes a question of how will the Biden administration, 12 days into its leadership and its power, and its leadership in the United States and within its own frame, how will it respond to effectively what is a China-sanctioned move that allows ultimately for not just greater influence within Myanmar itself, but a move towards some level of control over the Bay of Bengal, and so and as part of its longer-term interests. And so one question is, what does the U.S. do? But the second question that follows on is, how do we feel, and those here in the industry, how do you feel about sea channels that are more controlled by a Chinese PLAN plan rather than the current regime that is a multinational one led oftentimes on the high seas by the United States? So the first question on Taiwan is, there are moves, there are indications from the new State Department led by Tony Blinken that that have reaffirmed the United States' willingness and interest in defending Taiwan. There are multiple agreements short of mutual defense pacts, but the early indications are that the United States is, while maintaining on the one hand what is called a strategic ambivalence, on the other hand, it's showing, in fact, much more willingness and interest in supporting Taiwan. And then the second question, of course, is answered by saying, well, we're already seeing this more assertive China on the high seas. Will that maintain or threaten free and open movement along sea channels?
Stefanos, you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, I thought Markos put it very well, and certainly agree with that. I think if you talk to any sort of decision maker, whether in the business world or nonprofit or otherwise, when a crisis occurs, then it's already too late to respond. You're behind the 8 ball. So I think when Markos alluded to, as far as the steps that have been taken already in the administration to send signals to China, specifically about Taiwan, show the level of planning that has gone into place. It disincentivizes China from taking these actions. I'm thinking specifically of small things, but that they carry symbolism, such as a representative of Taiwan being present at the inauguration. I believe there was the lifting of official visits by U.S. officials to Taiwan, and in this way, the new government shows the continuity, at least in some senses, with the old one, at least building on the foundation that was there. And then, we talked a little bit about this during the panel. So I think in answer to the question, this work needs to be done ahead of time, and from the public signals that we've seen, there is planning for it, and it's being done in a way that shows a signal that our strategic interests will be maintained.
All right, we have a question regarding ESG, and I guess that's a good one for Kristin and maybe Kathy as well. How has the shipping industry responded to the emphasis on ESG and the Poseidon principles?
Yeah, I can start on that, John. Thank you. I think it's been the Poseidon principle really came at a good time, and it was also applauded by the industry. It actually was developed in close cooperation with the industry. So it was not like something just coming in as a surprise. And I think we are all going in that same direction. And as Mr. Kathleen talked about this morning, or the targets set by IMO were ambitious, they're important, and the Poseidon principle support it. So I'm just 20 banks now on board on the principles, meaning it did hit home. So I feel this policy and the industry, the financial industries, is really working towards alignment. And if you look at all R&D, all the new corporations across the industries, not just within the maritime industries, you see that this is really taking off.
I agree with what Kristin had to say, that the Poseidon principles came in at a pretty good time. With the cooperation of using a carrot and stick, the shipping companies that are following them do get some benefits on their financing. So a lot of time has been spent on the E part in the industry, that's for sure. What kind of new fuel will be used? We just saw Shell supposedly signing some contracts with 3 shipping companies to build some new VLCCs that will also have a tank for LNG. So lots of focus on the E, more and more focus on the S, especially when it comes to seafarers. More and more people are signing up for the Neptune principles. Our next big hurdle is to focus more on the G. And I think you'll see that, again, pressure from where the capital comes from. We're seeing a lot more activists, just even saw retail trying to get in on stocks this end of last week. So I think we're well on our way.
Okay, next question. Do you anticipate multilateral government action to enforce the IMO carbon emissions targets or other environmental rules, such as the Paris Agreement?
I wish we had more. I wish we had more cooperation along all the various nations and institutions, and not had different requirements and targets set by various countries, various areas. So we see now different targets coming from the EU compared to IMO. Having said that, it's better to have all in the same direction than you have no targets. So, but I think it takes some time to really have an alignment across.
If I may comment too, I think a lot of the targets will come from commercial. The market settles a lot of these things. If charterers are insisting on more emission-friendly ships that they're going to use, you know, that will push it faster than regulations.
Markos, do you see the Paris Agreement becoming a big focus again?
Without question. You know, this is something that the United States and the Biden administration has made central to both their campaign and something that they responded to immediately and activated immediately once they took office. I should say, you know, I sit in California, and of course, we have a large coastline and a very active port system, but California never left the Paris Accords, even during the last 4 years of the Trump administration. And so what you're seeing is a little more alignment amongst the states that are coastal states that have been very committed to the Paris Accord, and the federal government finally returning to the table and trying to actually take some leadership within this. I'd say the second thing that indicates the United States commitment has been the assignment of John Kerry, our former Secretary of State, a former presidential candidate, as the lead and special envoy strictly for these issues. So look for a much more aggressive pursuit of these issues and of the standards that are expected via Paris.
If I may add, John, as well, if you look at the letter from BlackRock, from Link, and from Larry Fink, what the requirements they will have for companies to really be achieving a net zero emissions by 2050. It just shows that that is not new. They had also the same type of requirements last year. Now it's even more specific. That just shows that the big investment communities will also drive in that direction.
I think that's a good way to end. We're running out of time, and I thank you all for your participation. It was a great panel, and I enjoyed being part of it. And now I think we'll send it back to Dave Gardy for the next panel.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. What we're going to do first is go to a quick commercial from the American Club, and then followed by Clay's intro of the next panel.